We all know the 5 major aspects in astrology. We know a trine bestows flowing energy between 2 planets, a square creates tension between 2 planets, and an opposition shows a face-off that requires balance. But what about the minor aspects in astrology? What about the parallel, the inconjunction, the quintile, and everything in between? These aspects help us to unfold so many layers to our blueprint that often go undiscussed. And yes, these minor aspects can echo in a different way to the major aspects, but in some cases, they can be equally as impactful even if these dynamics play out as a background hum in the soundtrack of our lives. And if our life was a song and our planets plus their major aspects created the lyrics and the melody, then perhaps these minor aspects show the unnoticed little riffs, the bass, or the undertones of the music. And even if these little tunes don't stand out upon first listen, they are equally as important to setting the mood and the vibe of the song. And this video will teach you what these aspects actually are and how they can play out in your life. And so first we will explain what each of these minor aspects mean and how they present in your life. And then we will go through some examples with subscriber birth charts to not only understand what these aspects mean, but how they could play out in practice. And so let's dissect the song and the elements of the song by diving deep into the minor aspects that we will be discussing today and to get a better understanding of what they mean. An inconjunction or a quincunx is an aspect marked by a degree difference of 150 degrees in the zodiac. And so how does the inconjunction look using music as a metaphor? And so it isn't a direct clash of energies, it's a complete lack of relationship. It's as if the song is a folk ballad, for example, but in the middle of a delicate acoustic verse, a loud and unrelated dubstep bass drop suddenly plays for 2 seconds and then the ballad resumes. It's not fighting the ballad, it's just kind of there. It's a little awkward, unrelated, and doesn't really make sense. And this aspect may feel like a constant irritating itch in your life. You have 2 parts of your personality, the 2 planets that I'm referring to that are so different that they don't even know how to fight. At least with a square, they know how to fight. These planets probably don't even know how to fight each other. They can't square up. And so this creates a persistent, nagging feeling that something is off and needs constant minor adjustments. And you're always tweaking the mixing board of your life, trying to make these 2 completely unrelated tracks somehow fit together. But the potential here lies in the fact that this constant forced adjustment can eventually turn you into a master of integration, able to skillfully blend energies that no one else thought could even exist in the same song. I have a lot of these in my chart. A really good example is I have a Virgo Mercury making an inconjunction to a Saturn in Aries. And when you think about it, Mercury in Virgo, it's very logical, it's very practical. Being in the 2nd house, I think very elementally. Saturn in Aries, it wants things done now. It wants to just go for things. It wants to trailblaze ahead. But that doesn't really get along with the methodical, take your time nature of a Mercury in the 2nd house. And with my Saturn being in my 9th house, it is more belief and expansive than the practical nature of the 2nd house. That is just one example. Obviously, I'll go into more when we go into birth chart examples, but that gives you a little idea of how this aspect can look. A quintile takes place when 2 planets are 72 degrees apart in the zodiac, and a biquintile takes place when 2 planets are 144 degrees apart in the zodiac. And so how would these aspects look in music? Well, these aspects are the unexpected magic. This isn't the simple, easy chord progression of a trine. This is the intricate, complex, and brilliant guitar solo that makes you ask, how did they even think of that? It's a highly stylized, clever, and unique creative flair. This energy often shows up as a specialized, almost genius level of talent, and in my opinion, it is one of the most underrated aspects in the zodiac when it comes to identifying what unique skill you may possess. It's a spark of creative brilliance. It's the unique signature in your song that is all your own. It could represent a natural, skillful way of thinking or creating or acting or being that is so unique to you that it feels almost magical. And this is the part of your song that showcases your art or your little bit of edge and your clever hidden little skill that really sets you apart in a pursuit. And with that being said, you don't need one of these aspects in your chart to have a skill or a talent, but what I am saying is this aspect can create a more direct expression of that spark energy. A good example in my own chart is that I have my Virgo Mercury making a quintile to Pluto and Sagittarius. And if you think about the nature of a Virgo Mercury, it is very detailed, practical. It likes to get to the root of the matter. It's very, in its work, and it gets down to the details. But a Pluto in Sagittarius loves to expand, it loves to explore, and it loves to transform through the big picture. And so it's almost like there's this little spark between my ability to be detailed, but also my ability to expand it into a big picture view that is, transformative. And one really good example of how that plays out is that I make very detailed YouTube videos that have a little bit of funk like this. Do. So there's your example of a quintile and a biquintile. An octile happens when two planets are 45 degrees apart in the zodiac, and a TriOctile happens when two planets are 135 degrees apart in the zodiac. The octile and TriOctile also go by these names. I just go by the names Octile and TriOctile because it is a lot easier to say. And I mean, semi-square isn't that hard to say, but that other word, well, I kind of have a lisp, and so I feel like my mouth would not be able to say it. So yeah, just know they are the same thing. And so in our song metaphor, these aspects are the subtle friction. This isn't the loud clashing note. This is the annoying low-level static humming in the background of the track. It's the kicking drum being just slightly off beat, or a high-pitched feedback sound that you can barely hear, but it sets your teeth on edge. And this creates a subtle but constant agitation. It's that background hum of irritation that pokes at you. It's not a full-blown crisis like a square, but it's a persistent problem that creates a drive to fix, perfect, or adjust things. It's kind of the energy of a pebble in your shoe, motivating you to continually refine and resolve an internal agitating pressure. A good example, I actually have my Sun in Libra making an octile to my Venus in Scorpio, and how this plays out is that anytime I think I am being too intense or maybe, a little bit too passionate or even a little bit possessive with my Venus in Scorpio, my Sun in Libra is like, oh girl, no, calm down, don't do that. And it kind of has this like little hum of, girl, you gotta calm down, but it's not like screaming at you, and so that's a way that one of these aspects can play out. A semi-sextile is two planets that are 30 degrees apart in the zodiac. And when we look at the semi-sextile in music, it's the most subtle connective tissues in your life song. It's like two instruments playing side by side, each in a slightly different key or tone, but they are right next to each other on the scale. It's not a major trine that allows for deep flowing harmony. Instead, it offers a tiny little melodic step, a sliver of opportunity. And so this aspect requires conscious effort to even notice that it's there. But if you do, it allows the two planets to learn and grow from the neighboring position. It creates a quiet, almost imperceptible pathway where one theme of your life or one instrument can offer a slight constructive modification to the next, helping the overall composition evolve gently, note by note, as a quiet nudge towards synthesis. And you can think of this aspect as the baby of a conjunction and a sextile, because a conjunction is a total fusion of two energies, like two planets becoming one, and a sextile is an easy opportunity for harmony. But the semi-sextile as their baby inherits traits from both, because as the closeness of a conjunction, but the potential of a sextile, and the catch is that this baby is brand new and needs to be taught everything. It's an awkward, unformed potential. An example in my chart, I actually don't have a semi-sextile between any planets, but I do between Chiron in my 4th house and Pluto in my 5th house. Chiron in my 4th house is exactly what you would think. Wounded in the home life. I had to move probably 16 times growing up. A lot of instability that I won't go into because this video is a tutorial, not a trauma dump. But in my case, my Pluto in my 5th house represents my discovery and transformation with my relationship to creativity. And so I am finding that the more creative I am and the more I let myself transform through creativity, the more I actually heal that wound of my home. But it really took a long time and a lot of conscious effort to do that. In fact, it wasn't until I made this YouTube channel that I realized how helpful the two were with each other. But it really is what you make of it with this aspect. And finally, the parallel and contra-parallel aspects don't relate to the chord structure or the rhythm of the song, and instead they relate to the volume and presence of the instruments. They are measured by declination, which is how far north or south a planet is from the celestial equator. And in your life song, this is where the planets are positioned on the soundboard. A parallel happens when planets have the same degree of declination and are in the same direction, both north or both south, whereas a contraparallel happens when two planets have the same degree of declination but in the opposite direction, so one is north and one is south. And I do have a tutorial on how to find these placements in the description because it's not very straightforward to calculate. And now some people compare these aspects to conjunctions or oppositions, but conjunctions and oppositions happen within the song's map or the zodiac, but these aspects are about the production of the song. They happen in a different dimension at the mixing deck. And so let's look at the parallel in music. A conjunction is two instruments playing the exact same note, but a parallel is like two planets or two instruments that are permanently wired together at the soundboard. And so no matter what note the guitar plays, the piano is also tuned up to that exact same volume. They are linked in intensity, and this acts as a hidden amplifier, powerfully fusing their themes. And so a very happy and vocal sun, but an aggressive drum beat, which is Mars, in a parallel, for example, would mean that the happy vocal also feels a little bit aggressive, and the drums also feel joyful, and so they kind of reinforce each other. And so one parallel that I actually have in my chart is my moon makes a parallel with my midheaven. For reference, my moon is in middle degree Leo, my midheaven is in early degree Taurus, and so by major aspects, they don't really align. But when you take the parallel, you fuse my emotional, vibrant energy with my public role and my reputation of being reliable. And so in my job and in YouTube, I exhibit traits that are both vulnerable, grounded, and offer practical, tangible value with my heart and my soul being put out there at the same time. And then we have the contra-parallel. And so in music, an opposition is two instruments on opposite sides of the stage having a direct call and response. And so a contra-parallel is a hidden balancing act. It's like one instrument is panned only to the left speaker and the other instrument is panned only to the right speaker. And so they are in constant dynamic tension, creating the song's stereo field. You might not notice it consciously, but this background tension is essential to the song's structure, forcing you to balance these two separate but equal forces. So the only contra-parallel that I have in my chart is that my ascendant in Leo makes a contra-parallel to my Jupiter in Aquarius in the 7th house. And essentially, I kind of have to go back and forth and balance my generosity for others with my actual care for myself and my humility, because there are times where I put too much significance on others because I truly see the value in them with that Jupiter in Aquarius. I love other people, but also with my ascendant in Leo, I want to be accepted for myself too, and I have not always gotten that. And so those two elements have always coexisted, but they coexist as a balancing act more than a combined force like with a parallel. So in this first person's chart here, I want to be going over 3 aspects. I want to go over inconjunct planets and then also the quintile / biquintile, because those do kind of mean the same thing in my opinion, but also semi-sextiles. And so like any reading I do, step 1, I write everything down, and I only write down the aspects that are being made to significant planets. And so, for example, you'll see there's a quintile between the ascendant and the lot of fortune. I don't measure aspects to the lot of fortune personally. It doesn't usually fully line up in my experience, although maybe a little. Or like, the semi-sextiles between Lilith and then Uranus and Neptune. I think those can matter a little bit, but it's a generational planet versus an abstract point in the sky. And so they may matter a little. I didn't write them down. I just went through the table and wrote down what was important. And you probably want to know, well, how do I even get these aspects on the table? And so I use astro-seek.com, link in the description. And when you're making your chart, you can click on the chart settings and just click all of the minor aspects. When it comes to the parallel and the contra-parallel, I also have a separate link to put your birth chart settings down in the description so that you can find those placements as well. So that covers that. But then the second thing is, well, how do I identify where the aspects are in the chart? I look at the table. I will go through what every symbol looks like just so you don't have to worry about that. And so first we're going to start with the inconjunction or the inconjunct. I don't think inconjunction is a word. I know I've been saying that. I didn't know it wasn't a word until I, was Googling and cross-checking and fact-checking some definitions. And yeah, apparently I said that wrong. Inconjunct or quincunx. That is the aspect we'll look at first. And the symbol for the inconjunct aspect will look like this that I have on the screen. Boom. There you go. Now you know. Let's get into what I do first. So the very first thing I do is, obviously I write down the aspects, but then I go through each aspect and I kind of write down a very baseline definition of what everything means. And so this person has 2 planets that are inconjunct. They have Venus in Cancer in the 12th house, making an inconjunct to both Saturn and Lilith in Aquarius in the 7th house. And so, okay, how do we combine Venus and Cancer in the 12th house with Saturn and Lilith in the 7th house? How do they relate? We know an inconjunct, they kind of feel unrelated to each other. And so there could be like a structured yet detached or unconventional partnership that kind of feels out of sync, with their Venus and Cancer 12th house values. And so it's sort of like there's something about their relationships that can't really sync up with their needs with that Venus. I keep it very basic at that. And then also Uranus and Capricorn in the 6th house, making an inconjunct to the ascendant in Leo. And so there's something about their unconventional relationship with health, work, or habits that's kind of disconnected from their identity. And so there has to be like little constant minor adjustments. I just keep it at that. And in order to sort of tie these together, yes, it does take practice, but as long as you look at things elementally, you'll have a good start, and then you can dive into the details. I always recommend that you look at your own birth chart first, because, if I say, the 6th house and the 1st house, that they have planets that are inconjunct, what can that mean? You're going to know about your own life better than everybody else, so maybe you know where that lack of connection comes from. So start with your chart, then practice on people you're close to, and then you can expand to other people's charts when kind of coming up with the definitions. But it really helps to start baseline at first, like I said, so that we can elaborate later and it will make more sense. Then moving on to the quintiles and biquintiles, we know it is a creative spark. It is one of my favorite aspects in astrology. And so anytime I'm kind of coming up with a basic definition for the quintile and biquintile, I always do what I say I do when I consider, the signs involved, the planets involved, the houses involved. Okay, how do all of these factors connect? How does the 12th house connect with the second house? How does Cancer connect with Virgo? How does the sun connect with the moon? But the really important thing when it comes to a quintile or a biquintile, because I say it's kind of that creative spark or a talent, is it's very hard to visualize how some planets, can spark like an action or a talent. A really good example, and part of why I wanted to use her chart, is she has her sun in Cancer in the 12th house, making a quintile to moon in Virgo in the second house. And so there's like a unique skill that she has when it comes to blending her identity with her practical, analytical, emotional needs. And it's easy to say, oh, how does a unique link between the sun and the moon make a talent? To me, a spark in your being and your identity and your emotions that is like a flare, a little bit of creative flair that you can use in your life. And so if you can't think of a way to action a placement, I would just interpret it as a creative flair. But if it's something, like Mars or Mercury, where you're actually doing something like writing or acting, and there's like a specific little function that it has that is a little bit more tangible, I would then maybe take that as like more of like a talent, although they're all talents, because there is a talent between the sun and the moon, because there is something to be said about, aligning your emotions with your identity and being able to like use the two to kind of spark and inspire each other, because it gives you a potentially strong and beautiful sense of being. I'll get into that later. And so that's kind of how I would interpret that. Or even to the angles, this person has Venus in Cancer in the 12th house, making a quintile. And so there could be some sort of creative flair, something about her Venus-like Cancer qualities that can really aid her in her career if she knows how to like apply that energy, or it can aid her in her public role. Like maybe she's seen as very sensitive, empathetic. And so that's something to keep in mind. And then with the semi-sextile, these are kind of opportunities to learn from each other. It's kind of a neutral aspect, can be positive, can be meh. It's really about how you use it, but it's like the equivalent of, when your teacher makes you work with your neighbor in class, but maybe you have assigned seats, so it's not like you're picking your neighbor. You kind of just have to work with the person next to you, and they bring their skills, you bring your skills, and you got to work with that. That's the best way to describe this aspect. And so a really good example, Sun in Cancer making a semi-sextile to their ascendant in Leo. And so there's an opportunity for this person to have their sun in Cancer in the 12th house learn from that ascendant in Leo. And for that ascendant in Leo, that's very radiant to learn from that sun in Cancer. And they can really kind of, help each other. Maybe the sun can help the ascendant express itself with more sensitivity, or maybe the ascendant can teach the sun to be a little bit more confident. And so that's a way to look at that. But also the next aspect, they have their Mercury in Cancer making a sextile to Jupiter in Virgo. Again, look at the signs, the houses, the planets. And so maybe there's something about, their expansive and detailed sense of practical growth, especially with their value in the second house, that can inform their Mercury in the 12th house. It can inform their thoughts. Maybe there's something about how they expand that can teach their thought patterns to be a little bit better. Or on the other side of that, maybe there's something about, their thought patterns and their intuition and their downloads that can help them build that practical value of a Jupiter in the second house. And then once I do that, I elaborate. I always start basic because it helps me get my bearings, and then I kind of elaborate on the specifics. And so I go into 2 examples per aspect on how this can look, just in case, maybe the client is reading what these aspects mean and they're like, I don't really know how that can look. And then you bring up the examples and they're like, oh, that kind of makes sense. And so for that Venus in Cancer in conjunct Saturn and Lilith in the Aquarius in the 7th house. And some of these I combine Saturn and Lilith just to kind of show you how I would combine, if there's a conjunction making, a trine to another planet, how that fused energy can look. And then in other examples within this reading, I separate them just so you can kind of distinguish how the energy looks. For this one, I fuse them. And so for the examples, I said, oh, maybe they crave privacy and like a deep, gentle, and empathetic connection with Venus. They want something that transcends and cares for them. But maybe when they interact one-on-one, there's something about the structure of how they commit and connect that doesn't easily connect with their emotional needs. There's just, and not like even an imbalance there, because it's not yin yang. It's kind of like, oh, they're not really talking to each other. Or maybe there could be a type of person that they attract, which is out of sync with their Venus needs. Or maybe there's like limitations that they put on themselves that doesn't open up their Venus to be loved. And so it can be different for everybody, because with a conjunction to the 7th house, and they have Lilith and Saturn conjunct their Aquarius descendant in the 7th house, this could mean that this is what they do in relationships. Maybe they're very intense and structured, but it could also mean that's the type of people they attract. And so maybe they attract very, controlling or intense people. I don't want to make assumptions. It can go either way. And so I make sure to note both. And I do that in both examples. And I also say, oh, maybe there's an intensity, yet a detachment in how they connect with others that really doesn't easily align with their sense of soft, intuitive, and safe value, making a sense of safety or synced value hard to achieve in connection. And due to the fact that it's an inconjunction, it can kind of nag at them like that awkward itch, and maybe they don't know how to fix it. I'll show a couple of more examples. I'll do one for the quintile and the biquintile. Oh, they have Jupiter in Virgo in the 2nd house, making a quintile to Pluto in Scorpio in the 4th house. As I said, they may have a specialized genius talent for using their practical, detailed, expansive energy with Jupiter in the 2nd house. Like they really do want to grow value, and they want to do it, methodically. And so maybe this can be used to skillfully and deeply transform their inner home or foundations, or vice versa. And so the first example is maybe they have a genius talent for finding one small practical item, or maybe they find a value that they have, and they're really able to use that to transform the feeling of home or their private space in a deep and powerful way. It's kind of like the art of knowing that a specific organizational system or a specific system will really help them heal. And so this could be something that they're naturally good at. Maybe they're really good at curating their space to be very intentional. I'm actually curious. I want to know if this resonates with this person, so I might ask them after this video. But it could also be the reverse. So an example too, oh, maybe they take their deep, transformative psychological workings from their Pluto in the 4th house, and they're able to find either new sources of income or self-worth or sense of security and values from that. This doesn't mean that they're rich, but they're able to derive some value from, their intensity or the intense themes of their childhood. And so they're able to take the magic, or this is kind of like the magic of taking a deep, transformative private experience and skillfully analyzing it to create new practical streams of growth in their material world or their values. And so I just make sure to list both. And I do the same thing with all of the aspects. Semi-Sextile, when coming up with the examples, I just think, okay, how can they work together? How can these aspects work together? Okay, they have Jupiter in Virgo, Semi-Sextile, Chiron in Leo. So maybe there's like something sensitive about their place in the world. And so there's this very potent wound that is very like true to their identity. And so maybe they can learn to work with their Jupiter in the 2nd house by taking practical steps to curate their materials or their worth or their resources to really, heal that Chiron wound. Or maybe the reverse. Maybe there's something about their wound that can really help them, to nudge them, to help them learn a practical skill as a way to grow from their wound. And so I always think of, okay, how can these planets work together like collaborators when coming up with examples for the semi-sextile? And so after that, I come up with the tips and tricks. I kind of elaborate on how to identify the energy, just, word it a little bit differently so that it resonates. And then I always try to create one a little bit more general tip for, each aspect, just something that they can keep in mind if they want to, balance that energy out, or if they want to let them play out in unison or harmony, like with the inconjunct aspect, maybe they don't want to always have that itch like super screaming at them. And so I try to give them a tip that kind of alleviates that pressure a little bit. And then I also try to give them a tip that really makes sure that both planets' energies needs are being met, because if both planets' energies needs are being met, the inconjunct aspect is a lot easier to deal with. So let's go into the tips. And so tip number 1, let's look at their Venus in Cancer making an inconjunct to Saturn and Lilith in Aquarius in the 7th house. And so the first tip, I said they should consciously schedule a buffer time. And so maybe before and after some social obligation or a one-on-one interaction or a date, maybe they should intentionally schedule alone time to do something that satisfies their private, gentle values, like listening to music or just being quiet, because this makes sure that both energies are managed no matter, how the interaction goes with the other person. And I just want to preface this by saying, just because there's an inconjunct with a 7th house planet to your Venus or whatever else, it does not mean you will never find love. I just want to preface this. This does not mean that you will never find love. It just means that this is energy that you can become consciously aware of, to exercise on both sides, so that when you do meet people or you are able to branch out, you're able to use more discernment, your needs are met better, and you can better discern, what type of people are actually good for me. And then you can find somebody potentially who really does accept the parts of you that need accepting. And so if I were looking at synastry, for example, if there's a Venus and an inconjunction to Saturn and Lilith, you kind of want planets that positively aspect that Saturn and planets that positively aspect that Venus, just so both play out. And this is not related to the reading. This is just, a disclaimer, just in case anybody watches this and they say, oh no, I got a bad aspect and I'm never going to find love. I have a T-square with my Venus at the apex. I have a horrible Venus in my birth chart. It's in Scorpio, and I found love. And so anybody can find love. I just want to put out there that both needs need to be met. And then, okay, back on subject. Tip number 2, maybe they can practice consciously compartmentalizing the energies to let both energies win without a feeling of lack. And so maybe when they're in relationship mode, they are just in relationship mode. Or maybe when they are, in their Venus mode, they are completely in their Venus mode. And so both energies can play out. And this also kind of helps this person to regulate, which can maybe help them to, connect better in their everyday life. And so the moral of the story with an inconjunct aspect, you just want to make sure that both energies can play out. It doesn't mean they have to play out together. They can play out separately. And so if this is something you can consciously do, this is something that can really help you manage this little awkward itch. Quintiles and biquintiles. As I mentioned before, you want to find an outlet to help this person express that creative spark. And so let's go to the fact that they have Saturn and Black Moon Lilith making a biquintile to the Sun and the Moon. And so maybe tip number 1, maybe they need to set boundaries. But this can kind of be their creative art form. And I know what you're thinking, huh? Boundaries? Art form? What? Well, a quintile and a biquintile is a little weird, so the tips are going to be a little weird too, because it's going to combine two disparate ideas into that creative spark, because that's what the aspect is. And so maybe when they need to interact with somebody with that 7th house, they can skillfully design one single rule or boundary for that interaction that creatively and directly serves either their need for privacy or their practical security. So maybe they say, oh, I can meet, but only for 30 minutes because I'm really tired, but I really want to, connect with you. Or maybe they can say, oh yeah, let's meet, but I'm going to be the one to set the terms. Or tip number 2, maybe they can use this spark to create a structured, authentic container based on their inner world. So maybe they make a creative project, a business, or just a highly stylized rule book for their life that really combines their feelings, their deep intuitive feelings with their needs. And then this can offer or be inspiration to others. I didn't go into this aspect a lot, but because there's a biquintile to the Sun and Moon, to Saturn and Black Moon Lilith, there could be something about their essence, their being and emotions that can inspire others. And so I said, oh, maybe take the things about you that you really like, or, the things that you're really good at, and put it into something that can help other people. And so that is just one example of how this can play out. This is something that you can do about it. And then, like I said, with the semi-sextile, just make sure that they can really inform and help each other. Make sure they're working kind of, in sync, and think of a way that these things can work in sync. And I know it sounds hard, but maybe the examples will help. And so, as we know, they have Mercury and Cancer in the 12th house, making a semi-sextile to Jupiter and Virgo in the 2nd house. How can I get these two to work together? You kind of have to think of outlets where the two can work together. And I know it's really hard, but it starts by looking at the houses. So, maybe I look at how does the 12th house and the 2nd house look? And so, maybe it's like you're channeling your subconscious mind into something material. And then, how do Jupiter and Mercury? Maybe I write and expand or read and communicate. That's just a good starting point. But in this case, I said, tip number 1, maybe they use the 2-column method. So maybe on a piece of paper, write down one practical goal on the left. And then on the right, maybe they write their little dreamy or silly intuitive thoughts. And then they force themselves to consciously draw a line connecting one idea that they have, one of those dreamy ideas, to a practical plan. Or maybe they need to teach themselves to ask for help, because maybe before they go to sleep, that's already incorporating the 12th house. They can consciously write down one practical, detailed problem or goal. That's the 2nd house. That's Jupiter. Goal is Jupiter. 2nd house is a detailed problem. It's very elemental. It's very tangible. Because when you write this stuff down as you go to sleep, that 12th house mind is gonna go wild. Maybe not wild, but when you sleep, you do process things. When you have Mercury in the 12th house, you probably process a lot as you sleep. And so it's a way to take the tangible and kind of connect it to the unseen. And I know what you're thinking. How do I even do this on my own chart? And the only thing I can say is, find the primary outlet. If I see Mercury, maybe writing or speaking is the outlet. If I see Jupiter, maybe it's reading. If I see Mars, maybe it's some sort of exercise. If I see Venus, maybe it's some sort of art form. Just start there and then build on that. I hope that helps. I hope that makes sense. Mercury's in retrograde, and so explaining things has been a little bit hard. But anyway, I will do that with the entire birth chart, and it will look something like this. Yeah, and so that is chart number 1. Let's go into the rest of the aspects for chart number 2. This is chart number 2 right here, and I know what you're thinking looking at that. Oh my God, that is a work of art. Look how perfect the shape of their birth chart is. This is actually my partner. Believe it or not, I've never actually deeply read my partner's birth chart. And trust me, don't worry, I'm not going to have bias. My chart ruler is in Libra in my 3rd house. I have a Virgo Mercury. I promise I will be objective, because I treat this chart like it's somebody else's chart. And then I kind of wanted to show this chart because A, I've never looked at it super in detail. B, he begged me to. He wants to know this stuff too. And then C, I kind of want to give examples on, how the aspect actually plays out. And so you can kind of learn, how to connect the words on the page or the interpretations to real life. And so let's get started with this chart. I am going into the Octile/TriOctile, and then the parallel and the Contra-Parallel. The reason I wanted to do his chart with the Octile and TriOctile, and also the parallel and Contra-Parallel, is I think that in his case, these aspects explain, not super major things about his personality that might not be easily spelled out by the rest of his chart, but they're definitely prominent enough to really matter and to really be seen in everyday life. And so I really wanted to use this chart. And so step 1, write all the aspects down. In his case, I'm only doing the Octile/TriOctile. He doesn't have a lot, but they're kind of big in his case, and so I wanted to mention them. But also the parallel and the Contra-Parallel, because he has a lot of them, and they really explain so much about his being. And so write the aspects down, and then we're going to snap our fingers, boom. Then I write down the basic definitions. Oh, he has Mercury and Venus in Cancer in the 12th house, making a TriOctile to Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 5th house. I made sure to list both Mercury and Venus in Cancer because they are conjunct with a difference of only 1 degree, and so they kind of act like, one energy in his chart, but also his Mercury and Venus are parallel. It's a whole story, but I included them as one, so deal with it. Anyway, and so I put that maybe it suggests a subtle but constant agitation between, their private, intuitive thoughts and values and their drive for big and optimistic creative expression. And it could feel like a persistent static or an itch where their desire for creativity and play just feels slightly offbeat with their need for private emotional safety, which creates a low level agitating pressure to adjust. I kind of know why this is in real life, but again, I want to be unbiased, so I just leave it at that. And then same thing with their ascendant in Leo, making an octile to Lilith in Gemini. This is a big one. And so this would suggest, a subtle but constant agitation between their radiant persona and maybe their raw instinctual way of communicating in groups. And again, I just leave it at that, but this is kind of a big one in his chart. I will explain why later. But when you're doing an octile or trioctile, it's kind of similar to the inconjunct. I know what you're thinking. They both offer a little bit of tension. But like I said, the inconjunct is the awkward itch that you don't really know how to scratch on your back. Whereas, the octile or the trioctile is the persistent little itch on your arm that you can scratch, but it's very subtle and it doesn't really ruin your life, but you're kind of oh, this kind of sucks. That's the octile or the trioctile. Then moving on to the parallel and the contra-parallel, I do the same thing, but one thing I do want to note is that if a planet makes a parallel or a contra-parallel to another point, it could trine that point as well. It could oppose that point. It could conjunct that point. If something is making a parallel and a contra-parallel, it could also make another aspect. It doesn't have to, but it can. And so I make sure to write down what other aspect is being made, if any. And so in his case, Sun in Cancer makes a contra-parallel to Jupiter in Sagittarius, but it also trines it. And so on a basic level with the contra-parallel, we know it's a balancing act. And so that maybe there's a balancing act between their private core identity or their intuitive core identity and their drive for joyful creative expression. And it's there's two separate but equal forces that constantly require balance. Or another example, Sun in Cancer making a parallel to Lilith. And so maybe there is something fusing his private core identity with that sort of Lilith, raw, untamed communicative side. And so with the parallel, like I said, it's a fusion of energy. It's if two instruments were put together, and so they kind of act as one. And it's interesting because he has a Cancer stellium. He doesn't really seem like a Cancer. Part of that is because the 12th house is hidden, so people don't always see that. But the, parallel between Lilith and Gemini is a very big one because he very well seems like a Gemini to most people, and he seems very intense. And so, like I said, parallel, fusion, contra-parallel, balancing act that are very dependent on each other. And then we go into the examples. And so with the octile and the trioctile, you kind of want to show, okay, how can these, aspects give each other a little bit of irritation, but not so tense like the square. And so, okay, how can the 5th house and the 12th house have tension? How can Sagittarius and Cancer have a little bit of tension? How can Mercury and Venus with Jupiter have a little tension? And so for my first example, I say, oh, maybe they sit down to start a fun project, but maybe there's a noise in their head or a private worry or a sense of static that really pops up. Is this really valuable to use my time doing this, or is this safe to express? And so in real life, I just want to go ahead and say how it pops up in real life. He has a lot of struggle expressing creativity in general, and a lot of it is because his family didn't promote it. I wouldn't know that if I was reading a stranger's chart, but I kind of want to show you how it could play out in real life. And so he really does want that creative fun of Jupiter and Sagittarius, but he might not know how to express it with that Mercury and Venus and Cancer in the 12th house. And so that is how it actually plays out. But for the sake of the reading, example number 2 is maybe he's trying to have a quiet, private, and introspective moment, but there's like a persistent agitating itch from their creative, playful side that won't let them rest. This is a literal manifestation because this dude, I swear to God, okay, he can stay up for like 22 hours working 20 of those, and then he'll come to bed and be like, I'm not really tired, I want to go have fun. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? This is another sort of like manifestation of this aspect because, you know, his Mercury and Venus and Cancer knows he needs to go to bed. The 12th house needs to go to bed. Cancer needs to take care of himself. But Jupiter and Sagittarius in the 5th house doesn't care because they just want to have fun. And so it's not really major for him, though. I want to say this isn't like a square where it's like absolutely destroying his life, but it's just like, I'm not really tired. And it doesn't really affect his health. It doesn't affect the quality of his life, but it is like a little itch or a little bit of friction that does exist. And so when interpreting these aspects and trying to come up with examples, just know that the octile and the trioctile, it's not that deep. It's not going to be that deep. It's just going to be a little, oh, this kind of sucks. I need to get that pebble out of my shoe. And then with the parallel and contra-parallel, this is actually, in my opinion, kind of the easiest way to come up with examples because with a parallel, you kind of treat it like a conjunction, except, you know, it's two planets that might not seem like they work together, and you're dealing with two different signs and houses sometimes when you're dealing with a parallel and a contra-parallel. So it's not quite like, oh, you know, a conjunction where the entities completely act as one because they have the same nature. It's like they act as one, but they could have a different nature. And so with the examples, let's look at the fact that he has Jupiter and Sagittarius in the 5th house, making a parallel to Uranus and Neptune and Capricorn in the 6th house. As we know, the 5th house and the 6th house don't usually traditionally make aspects to each other. Neither does Sagittarius and Capricorn, maybe an out-of-sign conjunction or sextile. But traditionally, if we're talking from an angular perspective, they don't make aspects. And so I want to go over kind of what an example could look like. And so for maybe they feel like their joy and their work are fused. Like he needs to be somebody who experiences joy in his daily routines, but also maybe he does find a sense of joy through how he does, you know, work through his day-to-day habits, his work, his health, and his routine. This is actually a very interesting one because, as you know, the 5th house of Jupiter and Sagittarius being fused with, like, you know, the house of work in Uranus and Neptune. This dude loves to work out for fun. That is a way that the 5th house and the 6th house could play out, but I'm not going to write that. I just want you to know and be thinking on that level. And so, as you know, their joy and their work are kind of fused together at a high volume. But also, example number 2, this fusion also means that their play is their work. And so maybe when they start a new fun hobby or a creative project, it can instantly and intensely amplify their work and drive, turning that fun into something structured, innovative, and idealistic. And they kind of work together as one. And so I wanted to put this one as sort of an example because it's about signs and aspects that don't really play out. And with Uranus and Neptune, he does have, you know, he likes to work out at night, like 10 p.m., 11 p.m., which is really weird in my opinion. That's a little bit Uranian. That's a little bit Neptunian. I don't know. Obviously, I didn't write that down because if this was a client, I wouldn't write that down. But even just from reading the examples, you could see how somebody could read that and be like, oh yeah, that kind of fits with my gym routine. And so that is an example of like how I come up with examples for parallels. Then for the contra-parallel, I kind of want to go into the example with his sun in Cancer making a contra-parallel to that Jupiter in Sagittarius. And so maybe one week, you know, they tap into that Jupiter in the 5th house energy where they're joyful, creative, and expressive, and they feel expansive and optimistic. But the next, maybe they want to retreat and be private. This is what the contra-parallel looks like. It's like maybe there's like two forces in your life, and one day you're all in on one and one day you're all in on the other. But if you are all in on one of those energy, you're kind of like, you know, having to balance it with that other energy. So it's like they're connected, but it's like a seesaw. And sometimes, you know, the sun is the one going up, and sometimes that Jupiter is the one going up, but it goes back and forth. And so one example, like I said, maybe one week he's very Jupiterian, but the next he's very sun-like. But then example number 2, maybe the balancing act could manifest in what he creates. So maybe there's a stereo effect where their Jupiter in the 5th house is kind of always related to those hidden private intuitive themes, but in a more balanced way. So it's like they're fused, but in a balanced way. And so maybe he's balancing the bigness of his expression with the privacy of the subject matter, as if one speaker is like the joy and the other is the inner world, which I find to be very true with how he communicates in general. And so after I do this with all of the aspects, that's when I kind of go into, how this can present and then the tips and tricks. So for the octile, for example, TriOctile, by the way, exact same thing. He has his ascendant in Leo, making an octile to Lilith and Gemini. So how to identify it, maybe it feels like they're on stage, but there's kind of like a little static in the microphone. And so there's something about his intensity that kind of seems a little bit off when he tries to, present himself, or maybe he feels like there's something wrong. And so tip number one, and this is what I do with the octiles, is I try to give that little irritation a job or an outlet. And so for this one, I say, maybe use your main confident persona from your ascendant to intentionally ask, those raw, curious, intense, and offbeat questions with Lilith whenever he's in a group, or lean into the intensity. And just for reference, because his ascendant and his Lilith also parallel, so they are fused, he has this problem where when he first meets people, they think he's way more intense and scary than he actually is. It's funny because everybody I meet thinks isn't he a Scorpio rising? No, his birth time is from his birth certificate. He's definitely a Leo rising. And when you look at all of the aspects, nothing really makes sense as to, why he looks intense. But also this, plus there is also his chart ruler, his sun making a parallel to Lilith. There is a lot of minor aspects being made between his chart ruler, his sun, his moon, his ascendant to that Lilith and Gemini. And honestly, I kind of think that's the culprit, because people do think he's intense, but not so much where it's a major hindrance, but it's to the point where it's you're a lot nicer than I thought you would be. And it's kind of something he brings up, but not that often. And so, maybe he kind of leans into that. That's one tip, but also maybe he exercises this energy through an outlet. Maybe he joins a club or a trivia team or an improv group, and this kind of sets the stage for this energy to play out in a way where that constant hum kind of is channeled into something good. And then going on to parallel or contra-parallel examples or tips, I try to, with the parallel, kind of give, what's the best way that these planets or these points and these houses could play together, or what is a way to diffuse that energy to make sure that they work towards something beneficial for the person. Let's look at the fact that they have their Mars in Libra in the second house, making a parallel to Chiron in Virgo. And so I suggest to use gentle action, because Mars in Libra, if you force a Mars in Libra to act very strongly, it's not going to end up well. They kind of need to lean into that softness, but also Chiron needs softness too. And so I make sure to kind of, say, what do both of these energies kind of have in common? Because that's what a parallel is. And it is easier when planets are conjunct to come up with what these have in common, obviously. But you can find a commonality in every house, every planet, and every sign. And so for their tip, I say, they try not to push through the pain, maybe act with the wound. And so if they feel that sensitivity, maybe they can take one very gentle balancing action with their Mars to meticulously address it. So instead of ignoring it, maybe they act on it, maybe they pay attention to it, however that looks for them. But also tip number 2, maybe exercise this fusion by acting on behalf of their wound. And so maybe use their Mars and Libra fairness to drive proactively and meticulously to build resources that really helps heal or soothe their not good enough wound. And so maybe they build a not good enough budget. Maybe they work on their budget. This dude, by the way, he's obsessed with budgeting, so he already kind of does this. But also another unique example is maybe they take action towards something that would build their self-worth, maybe exercise or dance or whatever brings them confidence. And so I try to incorporate that into the tips. Same thing with the contra-parallel. I try to think, okay, how can they balance this? I kind of treat it like an opposition when coming up with the actual tips, but just know that it's not an opposition because it doesn't have to oppose in the birth chart. And so, oh, that Sun in Cancer making a contra-parallel to Jupiter in Sagittarius. Maybe they find an outlet that sort of combines that fun side with their inner world. Maybe they start writing. Maybe they start, doing art. But also, I'll try to do a tip that will kind of manage both sides. So, okay, maybe schedule time to intentionally make sure that both energies can play out. Maybe schedule that creative playtime with Jupiter and that retreat time with the Sun, and just stick with it, because if they consciously channel it, then it won't be as much of a liability. And so that's kind of how I approach, reading a parallel, a contra-parallel, an octile, or a TriOctile, and then I combine everything together. I obviously do every step with every aspect, and it looks something like this.